I'm going to be talking today. This is a talk I did at the Max-Planck-Institut in April 2025 about the relationship between delusions and democratic decision making, because I think in a lot of ways that's been uh, really misportrayed. So the first part of the talk is going to focus on the nature of these delusions and to try to define those in a more scientific way. And this whole issue of decision making, this whole issue of how delusions impact decision making has been quite a big issue for us at SDI over the last 10 years. And I think I've kind of put my finger on now exactly kind of the reason for that. I think a big reason for that is because there's been an effort to sort of fuzz over the decision making component of democracy in the last 20 years and to kind of act like democracy is just a talking shop where people should be engaged. But there's not really an actual decision-making process. And in my view, that kind of decision avoidance is really the beginning and the end of the problems with modern democracy. And I think the idea, just this idea that democracy is not primarily a decision-making vehicle has become unfortunately very, very widespread in society. And that's why I would like to counteract that and show how harmful that idea is with this talk. So, I mean, I was giving a talk in Berlin about 5 years before this one. And they said that I was talking to a lady and she basically told me, or rather, she basically asked me during the presentation if she was involved in making decisions like in referendums like in Switzerland or in Ireland, if she then would be responsible for those decisions, like for her actions. And I said, yes, of course, you're responsible for your own decisions. You have to take responsibility for what you did. And she responded, and I will really never forget this, that she just didn't want that. She wanted to take part. She wanted to have the policy she liked to be implemented, but she just did not want to take like responsibility for it. And that is an attitude that's come to dominate like political discussion actually in the last 10 years, even among democracy experts. What I would hear now is not that democracy is a decision-making process with clear components, but rather that it is kind of, it's a chaos. That's where everyone talks all at once. The outcome isn't important. Like it's just a kind of generalized free-for-all. And I think that is really, really damaging. And this is why. What you're basically saying is democracy is pandemonium. It is confusion, it's chaos, it's disorder. Okay. But pandemonium, that disorder, that chaos is where the demons live. That's where demons thrive, in pandemonium. It's their homeland. And I think this is like a really unexpectedly apt analogy and kind of really hits on some really key point that isn't really discussed enough. And it's a really important thing to hold on to as I continue my talk. Living without accountability allows you to maintain your delusions. Delusions aren't rational, they are disordered and chaotic. So our mission should be to get rid of delusions to the maximum extent possible, or at least to expose delusions so that they can be acted on. So they're not just things that, we run away with. They're things that are confronted and are acted upon. Another important thing that I ask you to hold on to is that our entire conversation about rationality has become extremely irrational. So, rational means, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. It's not hard. You can be logical and you can come to a different conclusion than I might come to, also being logical. It does not mean we all converge on the one right answer. It does not mean that people who disagree with us are inherently irrational. Okay. So I think unfortunately over the last, again, about over the last 10 years, experts, media, academics have become obsessed, unhealthily obsessed, in my view, with what they consider to be minor irrationality. And that usually comes down to people disagreeing with them, but it could also come down to people being wrong about something. But even so, we are all often wrong about things. We are all often irrational in minor ways, where there's all things we're all irrational about in one way or another. But that obsession over trying to eliminate those minor irrationalities are kind of like the essence of being human, has allowed them to neglect major irrationality, major, very disturbing rationality, which I think has been a big mistake. So, and one of the ways it has affected us is that political science tends to see kind of a base normal person and then say, okay, there's base normal people, and then sometimes things are irrational, or sometimes, the decision making process goes wrong, and therefore there's something wrong with people, right? The problem is just people generally. That's a very, very unsophisticated way of looking at the world. And this major rationality is not some kind of uniform problem contributed to evenly by every human being. I believe that one of the major factors and major sources of major irrationality that kind of just really insidiously screws with the decision making process, to put it technically, um, is the dark tetrad. And these dark tetrad traits that I see surface occasionally, not as often as you think, but occasionally in digital democracy. You can see them kind of starting. And you know that, this is at the basis of a lot of our problems and our problems with conventional democracy today as well. It's just unspoken, it's unexamined, it's unacknowledged. It just creates more problems by doing that. So you might be wondering at this point, okay, like what is this dark tetrad? It is a framework developed by psychologists Delray L. Paulhus and Kevin M. Williams, and it's become very influential in psychology and psychiatry. Because it deals with four overlapping personality traits that have long been of interest to psychiatrists. And those are psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians, and sadists. As you can see, they're a really delightful group of people. We're generally talking about the subclinical level here. Most people who are like clinically have these traits are in clinics, as the name implies. So a lot of people would ultimately end up potentially in jail or in psychiatric institutes. There are many, many people, however, who score highly in these traits without it impinging on their functionality to that degree. And those are the people I'm mainly focusing on here. So, first, psychopaths. They're possibly the most understood of dark tetrad traits because they're kind of extreme. They're the most extreme to some extent. Um, they're characterized by very low levels of empathy. So, a psychopath with who's a particularly extreme psychopath, like something they may do, and we see this in criminal law, like sometimes is like, they might just kill someone because they're curious about what happens when you kill them. And that's very, very disturbing, but it's can happen with people who are that low in empathy. They just don't feel what you feel. Um, so, like other members of the Dark Tetrad, and very relevantly for us in decision-making processes, psychopaths are really good at being manipulative. They're really good at being deceitful. They're often impulsive, but they're also very charming often. And those seeming contradictions actually make a lot of sense if you think about it. It's very easy to be charming if you're also dishonest. It's much harder to be charming and likable when you're honest. Um, it's also easy to be impulsive if you do not, as psychopaths, don't foresee the consequences of what you're doing. So in experiments, they've done experiments. Some psychiatrists have done experiments on psychopaths, and um, what they'll do is they'll basically kind of like do something like count down to giving you an electric shock. So that the idea is there's a trigger, and that trigger is followed by like something unpleasant happening to you. So people who are not psychopaths typically start to dread that thing. They kind of know, okay, when this clock counts down, I'm going to get an electric shock, and just start to kind of like tense up because they're expecting it. But psychopaths, on the whole, just don't do that. They're like, I don't know what could happen. Maybe something different will happen this time. It's very strange. And uh, however, it's interesting for us because it tells us that they often fail to anticipate what are for other people very foreseeable negative consequences, right? That's quite significant. Um, so that obviously impacts decision making. And we do know that psychopathy is at least partly caused by physical differences in the brain, and it's fairly widespread. So they're probably 1% of the population are psychopaths. I mean, many of them nonviolent, right? And so you might, run into a psychopath later today, or you might live with a psychopath. You might be a psychopath. These are not just one-off or very, very unusual behavior or personality traits. They're relatively common in our society. So that's just one part of the Dark Tetrad. There's three more to go. When it comes to democracy, narcissists are possibly even more of a problem for us than psychopaths are because narcissists like to take part in public exercises. They have a grandiose sense of self-importance. So they're drawn to public participation because it gives them the attention that they so recklessly seek. They tend to believe that they deserve special treatment. So again, problematic is that if you make rules, narcissists will believe that those rules apply to other people. They won't believe that those rules apply to them. So it's very, very hard to make that connection for them. Um, they're also often able to convincingly lie in the service of maintaining their self-image. So this is again an issue because the average person doesn't think in terms of such grandiose lies. Because they don't think about that, because they've never thought of telling a lie like that themselves, they find it very difficult to detect those kinds of lies in other people. Eventually they will, but it can take a pretty long time of, sustained behavior for them to do that. Um, like psychopaths, narcissists are quite manipulative. So if you were to confront a narcissist, so if a narcissist is bullying somebody and that person confronts them, what often happens is then that the narcissist has kind of a temper tantrum and claims that they're the victim of the person that they are actually victimizing. And the reason that's so difficult for us to deal with is because as a bystander, that's often very difficult to determine who is in the wrong in that situation. Often because a narcissist will react in an extreme way that's very disturbing, like maybe like crying and screaming and things like that. Usually bystanders go into kind of damage control mode and they will punish the other person to make the narcissist shut up. So it's very, very damaging kind of cycle in a way that teaches a narcissist to keep doing what they're doing because it works, and ends up often with innocent people being punished. So you can see that this is like just really a dark and problematic reality of our world that makes it very hard, that throws a monkey wrench in public participation, right? This is about what this is. It's about public participation. And in comparison to this, just the things that people are worried about, like flat earthers or tinfoil hat wearers, are just like completely negligible. What's a lot more problematic and likely to occur is someone like a narcissist coming along and completely just like disturbing your decision-making process in ways that people find it hard to put their finger on, but that do damage to people and disturb the decision-making process. The third element of the Dark Tetrad is Machiavellians, also sometimes known as high-mock individuals. Unlike psychopathy and narcissism, Machiavellianism is not a diagnosable personality disorder. Many Machiavellians function pretty A-okay, for themselves anyway. So Machiavellians could be high-mock individuals could be up to 16% of the total population. So this is pretty big numbers of people we're talking about here. They usually are not very empathetic. They're also good at being manipulative and deceitful. They're usually not impulsive, which is kind of why they kind of manage more a lot of the time in society. But they do often have cynical views of other people, and they're usually obsessed with gaining power. So someone who's like a very high-mock individual might agree with a statement like criminals are just the ones stupid enough to get caught. Criminals are the only ones, they're just the dumb ones, right? Who get caught. So this kind of betrays kind of a certain understanding of the world that's quite cynical. And because of these cynical beliefs, they usually tend to deal with situations in an overly harsh way. And in particular, what's relevant for democracy is that rather than just kind of trusting that people will usually act in a way that's pretty okay, and therefore, if you're persuasive, people might see the logic in your arguments, Machiavellians would like tend to force people because they at bottom believe that there's a lot of more negativity than there is. So they don't like to convince people, they try to force them into doing what they do. That, as you can imagine, in a public decision-making process, goes wrong a lot of the time. It throws a monkey wrench into things. Okay, finally, sadism is a recent addition to the Dark Tetrad. It used to be a Dark Triad. All of this is quite disputed among professionals as well, but the general gist of it is pretty solid. Despite the fact that sadism is not a diagnosable condition, partly because of concerns that people would escape criminal culpability if it was, we all kind of tend to know what a sadist is. They are a person who enjoys inflicting pain and suffering on others. And a fairly common thing for a sadist to do is to seek activities where they're allowed to inflict pain and suffering on others. So I think it's important to understand that a lot of the time these Dark Tetrad personalities are functioning within our society in ways that work for them. So the classic example would be becoming a prison warden, because prisoners kind of de facto suffer, even if you don't do anything particularly mean to them. they, by virtue of their condition, are suffering, and you're allowed to participate in inflicting that suffering. So that would be something for statists to do. Something, again, relevant for democracy is that they like enforcing rules on people. So rather than having rules that are generally enforced in a realistic way or in a genuine way, a statist will take your rules and they will enforce them in ways that inflict damage on other people and are humiliating to other people. So in doing that, they tend to subvert those rules, and that is where the problem starts. And sadism, when it was a personality disorder, accounted for about 8% of all people. And so people think. So that is, again, if true, that is a quite large number of people. So obviously, diagnosing a particular person is a job for a trained psychiatrist. There's all kinds of other conditions that can lead to people behaving irrationally, right? I mean, people also have severe depression, people have schizophrenia, some people have bipolar disorder. Those are all things that kind of prompt sometimes irrational behavior and irrational decision making. There's also lots of conditions that can be confused with any of these things. There's also normal behavior that can be confused with these things. Part of the reason they're able to do such damage publicly and in their relationships with other people is because it's very hard to diagnose an individual, basically, and say that that person is behaving this way. It's pretty slippery. So that's something that needs to be considered, is that I wouldn't focus myself on trying to diagnose a particular person. I'd try to focus on preventing society-wide behaviors that are abused by them. That's, I think, where we are in this debate. There's also other things that I kind of went into a little bit more in my talk, but that interfere with rational decision making that I believe are understudied or underconsidered in our current talking about democracy and consideration of public decision making. One of those things is that a lot more people take drugs than most people think. And when I say drugs, I mean kind of drugs that influence your mind or your way of thinking about things. So performance enhancing drugs, antidepressants, hard drugs, prescription drugs, a lot of those influence people's decision making capabilities, sometimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse, especially when they haven't been prescribed those drugs. Like lots of people take drugs that are not on prescription. That's kind of unknown. Lots of people take prohibited drugs like cocaine and meth and things like that. These all have an impact on decision making. I think also age-related decline has an impact on decision making. These are all very thorny issues that I think we should be looking at more as people concerned with the way collective decision making is made. But today, I'm not going to. Today, I'm going to go into the second part of my talk, which is to think about how the Dark Tetrad affects democracy and democratic decision making. And even if according to the figures, if you were just to add them all up, that amounts to 29% of people scoring very highly in Dark Tetrad traits. That's a lot. Just under a third of people. The numbers probably aren't that high because of overlap and because of the spectrum that people score on those things. But nonetheless, I think it does make us realize that this is quite a significant number of people who score highly in these traits. And therefore, in any group you're dealing with, you're going to end up with people like that in that group. So one of the most important and irritating things about the Dark Tetrad to remember is that what works on other people doesn't necessarily work on them. They don't really care too much what the impact is that they're having. I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about how to prevent them from dominating a decision-making process in ways that still preserves freedom. So one way that they affect decision-making is that their chronic impulsivity disrupts accountability and cause and effect. And I think one of the most significant ways that this has impacted decision making in democracy is to kind of create a world that works for Dark Tetraders. I think over the past 30 years, Dark Tetraders have kind of managed to change the way we make decision making in a way that works better for them, but not for anybody else. So if we look back at the beginning of the internet, you think the first viral content, it was accidental. No one meant to do that. Or to be famous, people didn't think they're going to get famous doing things like this. Dark Tetraders kind of took that and understood it in two different ways. The narcissist way of understanding this was to say, wow, I'm jealous of these people who are getting attention. I just want attention. I don't care if it's good attention or bad attention. I don't care if I'm destroying things. I don't care if people dislike me. I really just want attention. So this was very attractive to narcissists. Machiavellians would see something like this and think, okay, this kind of dumb thing is just what people want, right? People are not caring about the important issues of the day. They just want to see hamster stats or something, right? And that's, again, it's just a very jaded view of things, but it's a typical Machiavellian view. So give them more of the stuff, right? So to think about how this kind of has had an impact on us, I would say there's two ways. One is that a lot of content, publicly produced content, has become very jaded and attention seeking, and also just produced to work in the moment and not in order to last. Now, people think that says something about the people consuming this. I don't think so. There's a lot of very, very high quality entertainment that is consumed by people. The entertainment industry actually puts a pretty high standard on its work a lot of the time. This is more to do with the news industry and things like that. The conventional news industry really bought into this idea that people just wanted content for the moment. So it says a lot more about the people producing this content than about the people consuming it. But this is what we've created. We've created a very short-term outrage merchant kind of media cycle. And as I said, it kind of just feels to voters, it just feels like they're being screamed at all the time by these people. Like one particular example that I think about this that I'm just going to say shortly here is that in my field there was a book produced years ago called Democracy for Realists, and the crux of that book was that American elections are greatly influenced at any event on things like shark attacks and the weather and other unrelated matters, but basically shark attacks, right? Because the point of this book is like that's how dumb people are. That's how dumb people are. Like they decide things just based on something like a shark attack. This central claim was absurd, and it was also quickly disproven. But it's interesting for two reasons. The first reason is that this book got tons of awards from other political scientists who really loved what it allegedly proved, that people are dumb, because it allowed them to do what they wanted to do. And the other thing that is interesting about it is that it kind of justifies their own behavior. It's a very Machiavellian take. These people are idiots. We finally found a way to prove that they're idiots, and that justifies us in ignoring them, right? Very Machiavellian. It doesn't necessarily prove that. But they lapped it up because it kind of went together with their own personality issues. The other thing is that just because you think it's true doesn't mean it is true, right? So just because someone comes along and says something like that doesn't mean it's true. It says more about you, the person propagating this theory, than about everyone else. And as I say, this was in fact disproven by other research. So that's one way that, as we see, the Dark Tetrad is kind of just, it's producing the media that it believes works, but it doesn't, and people don't like it, and people actually just trust the media more than ever, right? So it has to do what's going on in their head. The other way that Dark Tetraders have worked, and again, this has a lot to do with Machiavellians, is that they decided that they don't like having to have elected officials make decisions. They don't like having to deal with people. It's annoying because they already have all the right answers. So getting them pushed back, people is just taking up too much of their time. So since the 1990s, and there's been a lot of literature written on this. One book I would recommend is Ruling the Void by, I think, Peter Mayer. Anyway. It's a very good book. And it kind of describes to some extent how a lot of decisions are pushed out into agencies, into courts, into international organizations, into central banks, into lobbyists who write a lot of laws now. And those things are, what those things have succeeded in doing is to push things outside of the realm of politics, where this decision can be made and then just kind of is communicated to people in the end, right? Because they wouldn't understand the decision anyway. Now, that also has just made people very angry, because rules are being made in ways that no one understands. You just get the rule communicated to you in the end without getting a say on it. So voters are left in this situation where on the one side, they're being screamed at by kind of mayfly outrage generating media that irritates them. And on the other end, rules just keep happening that no one really understands how they happened, and the rules are just impossible to change. So this has created a kind of Dark Tetrad world where they get to do what they want to do. Machiavellians get to make the decisions without other people interfering with them. Sadists and narcissists get to run riot and in the media, screaming at people all the time. It works for them and it works for no one else. So this is a kind of problem that we've allowed the Dark Tetrad to drive the way we see these things to drive this cynical, jaded view that actually is untrue. And we don't need to be living this way. So that's way one. Way two, that they're affecting democratic decision making. Dark Tetraders tend to dehumanize others, and one of the ways they do this, which is I think very important to differentiate from anger, is extrajudicial punishment. So Dark Tetraders really like to punish at will rather than according to laws. There's been a huge push again in the last 10 years to prevent people from expressing anger. There's this idea that anger is wrong, that no matter how angry you are about a policy, you should just not express that anger. You should coach yourself in, nice terms and things like this. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with expressing anger or disgruntlement. Anger can be a very straightforward emotion. I don't think there's anything wrong with telling someone you're angry at them or you're angry with how things are going. I do think there's something wrong with punishing people extrajudicially, which is what I'm going to talk about here. One of the most obvious examples of how this has taken off is canceling. Canceling is not about being angry with someone. Canceling is about punishing people for perceived and sometimes often invented reasons. So a key thing with canceling is that those reasons, the reasons for canceling someone are generally not universally shared. So a lot of people would agree that the cancelee has done nothing wrong. There is no law that they have broken. This is key. So they've never been able to attain society-wide agreement that someone should be punished for these things. In addition to that, usually the punishment happens by socially shaming and ostracizing people, by seeking to erase them from the public record, so to symbolically kill them and their descendants, to extinguish them, which is kind of like almost like biblical level of punishment. Like this is like punishment levels from the ancient world. To call them medieval would be wrong. To force cancelees to grovel, which is also something that people who don't score highly in Dark Tetrad traits usually like. Most people don't like other people to grovel. It makes them deeply uncomfortable when that happens. Dark Tetrad people like it because it gives them power. They isolate people. They seek to deprive them of a livelihood, which is, an insane level of punishment, right? We normally don't mete that out to murderers. And that, trying to deprive people of a livelihood, it kind of ensures their ongoing impoverishment and humiliation. So also typical of cancel culture is that it doesn't just extend to the person who said to do something, it indulges in collective punishment. So again, collective punishment is like, you're kind of going back to ancient times when you kind of see things like that really happening. It's not really, like consistent with a modern approach to democracy. So collective punishment means we use the opportunity to punish or intimidate a large number of other people. So anyone who believes the punishment is going too far or who defends the victim of a cancellation themselves will be punished. Like I said, this is kind of like you kind of would see people kind of talking this way in biblical times or in ancient Roman times or maybe in ancient Greek times, although even they did a lot of work to try to prevent that kind of thing. This is kind of like pre-civilization levels of dealing with issues. Any civilization. So typically, it really hard needs to be said that typically the people who are attracted to canceling are often sadists because it allows them to do exactly what sadists like to do, which is to punish people out of all proportion to anything they may have done, but under the guise of delivering justice. Canceling was basically created by and for sadists, and it's unleashed sadists on our society, which is why it kind of continues to roll on under its own weight. I mean, why would they stop something that is fulfilling their psychological needs so well? So the dark, the dark tetrad, like the reason this is so harmful is that if you think about it, what this is doing is destroying the relationship between cause and effect in our society, in our legal system. You're basically saying, no, there's been no decision, there's been no process, but nonetheless, you will be punished severely. And you'll often find that people who are subjected to dark tetrad abuse over a prolonged period of time, because of course there are people who are subjected to this in their personal lives, right? People who have parents who score highly in these traits or other caregivers who abuse them, essentially, right? Those people are often mentally damaged because of things like this. They find it very difficult to differentiate between cause and effect sometimes. They find it difficult to understand the processes around them. And the reason because of that is we've been subjected to things like this over a prolonged period of time, where the clarity between cause and effect, where processes like that we have held to in our society, we've tried to develop them over thousands of years of like clear laws, clear sentencing, clear punishments, those things are being ignored in them. And when that happens to people in a personal way, they tend to get a bit confused and they find it hard to deal with that later in life. This is now what we're doing to ourselves on a societal level, creating this confusion, making it hard for us to make sound decisions that are based on cause and effect. This is something that Dark Tetrad often does. You'll see it's almost like the first thing they try to do is to try to get rid of a logical process and replace it with their own whims, according to what they want to do. Very, very, very dangerous to go down that route. However suboptimal your justice system is, a normal person would focus on making the justice system work better, not on blowing the justice system up and creating a free-for-all situation. It's dangerous. Okay. To add to these already considerable issues, we've permitted another thing that Dark Tetraders really like to do and they excel at, and I would call that thing agency stealing. So this is something I've made up. The idea of agency theft or agency stealing is something that basically I came up with to describe things that I was seeing happening in my own field on a regular basis. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. So typically what happens is that someone, usually a narcissist in this case, tries to set themselves up as the representative of a group that has limited agency. So often, recent immigrants are a good example because they usually can't vote, children, nature, and my favorite, future generations. So the person is basically saying that they represent all people yet to be born. You may represent yourself, but they don't represent themselves. They represent millions of future people, and you have to respect that. Right. So, according to that. So that's why they get many votes and you don't. So the Dark Tetrader usually says that they're kind of synonymous with this group, and therefore criticizing them is criticizing that group. The group may be real, they may be completely fictitious, but the Dark Tetrader now speaks for them. And unfortunately, one of the vehicles that allows this to happen has been AstroTurf NGOs. So AstroTurf NGOs are NGOs that don't really have any real members. They're usually just somebody funding a lot of other people who are employed by them. We'll go more into that later. But the bottom line is that these AstroTurf NGOs are usually kind of run or employ the kind of person, and unfortunately I say this with no exaggeration here, the kind of person who kicks a disabled person out of the way in order to represent disabled people. It's really very aggravating. Grassroots groups complain about it a lot. And they then go on to behave in a way, as you can imagine, with that kind of person. They don't behave in a way that, sensibly attempts to really improve the lives of the people they claim to represent. Of course they don't do that. They behave in ways that are completely self-aggrandizing, that are gratuitously offensive, that seek to maximize the attention that they're getting, and often backfires on the group that they're claim that they're representing, but really they're just using, right? So this has led to an increase in polarization in our society, because outsiders just kind of feel like, wow, I mean, where did you come from all of a sudden with all of these crazy demands? Usually just some random person who's being paid to do that, right? Often not a genuine representative of such a group who's been maybe elected or something like that. It's pretty bad. They are basically body snatchers, as the slide says. So finally, another thing that Dark Tetraders tend to do and feel entitled to do is to bypass the democratic processes to ensure the right outcome that, of course, has been communicated to them, right? It's like they're having a vision, a religious vision that's communicated the right outcome to them. And, they have a unique responsibility, therefore, to overturn everybody else and implement that, kind of truth. It's, in their view, usually not a God-given truth, but it has the same value as a God-given truth would have to a very religious person. So in recent years, they kind of have focused on doing this, and I get calls all the time from NGOs and activists and lecturers asking me how they can ensure that the right outcome happens. And I think like a good example of this over the last several years was the extreme environmental movement. I think if you wanted to do good to the environment, this was the exact wrong way to go about. getting anything done that was in the interest of the environment, because they kind of tried to force people into lifestyle changes that they knew were very unpopular. So, like, just things like forcing veganism, ending livestock farming by force, ending the banning of single family homes, trying to ban things like personal hygiene, or really going on like a kind of crusade to get people to eat insects, just things people really, really didn't want to do. But they would kind of come up with these kind of like decrees, like they were going to force people to do it. Like, I mean, these are activists, or people who never really had that kind of power to enforce those things, but they would kind of always go about kind of coming up with these ideas that would entail maximum suffering, right? Maximum suffering, maximum misery, unnecessarily. There's lots of good environmental policies that would do a lot of good without actually forcing people to live in misery and things like that. These people did not want that. For some reason, they really wanted to harp around on the maximum suffering. It just turned so many people off. I think it's going to completely backfire from an environmental point of view. So, but however, they would go about doing this, right, to try to enforce the right outcome, and they would try to come up with ways to bypass democratic mechanisms. So again, as I'm saying, that's just, I would get a lot of phone calls, and I saw people doing it as well a lot, thinking of ways to get past democracy. Sortition was a great example. They should just randomly select people to participate, or they should just enforce things, or they should do it with market solutions. These are the ways that they tried to enforce what they viewed as the right outcome on other people. Right. So as I hope that this demonstrates, the Dark Tetrad does not present difficulties. It's mayhem. It caused all these things kind of combined to create just this feeling of mayhem and confusion and anger. And it is not just a problem. This is pandemonium. It is like just everything goes. The robot gets thrown out. Confusion, chaos, whatever. Everybody's screaming at everybody else. Right. This is not good for democracy. Clearly. You don't have to be a political expert to see this. Democracy is not the natural human condition. So, very few humans have ever lived under a democracy. And in the grand scheme of things, this dark tetrad behavior can't really go on. I mean, it's not a problem that's unique to democracy. It's actually something that's way worse in systems that are empires, or where you have a king, because if the king obviously is a person who scores highly in dark tetrad traits, you have an even bigger problem than you do under democracy. And that's why in a democracy is a clever way to run a society, because it's one of the reasons it is, because you spread the risk of these character traits among a lot of people, right? They may be a lot of people, but they're still the minority. So the question we're going to ask in the third part is, okay, given these rather insidious, and I hope that is apparent from what I've said, these are quite insidious and kind of somewhat subtle problems that they create, that kind of go around, like, as a person would say in German, around 13 corners in order to kind of get to their goal. They are very kind of not exactly very able to sink your teeth into, right? They're very weird and kind of working on the edges, but they are like truly, truly, truly very damaging, unfortunately. Once you kind of understand the trick, you're like, okay, yeah, I see it now. Okay, right, I see it now. You kind of get to the point of understanding the pattern, but they can be quite difficult to diagnose. So how do we deal with them? This is what I'm going to try to talk about in the third part. How do we deal with these people, and try to mitigate the impact of their dark tetrad traits? Because try to remember, they're not really in control of what they do for the most part. Or at least seemingly they find it very, very, very difficult to control their behavior. So, trying to get them to control themselves is I don't think the strategy that's going to work. At basis, they're all addicts. They're all addicts of some kind or another, kind of enslaved to fulfilling their own psychological needs. And that's what makes them easy to manipulate once you understand them. So the first thing we need to do to prevent this kind of thing from taking over is to stop impact investing. So to stop wealthy NGOs intentionally funding projects to alter society without getting people's consent, right? Very clear why this would attract dark tetraders as a thing to do and amplify dark tetrad behavior. You're basically saying, we're trying, albeit somewhat ineffectively, to give people carte blanche to implement what they think is right, bypassing the political systems we've invented for that. So impact investors typically are aware that most people don't want the goals they want, but in their view, that's because people are stupid and ignorant. And therefore they have a right to employ people to work more or less almost like a corporation to try to achieve the goal that the people or groups of people funding them want to achieve, right? So it's kind of like almost like hiring like a crew of people to launch them at the goal you want to achieve. Well, there is a way to achieve those goals through politics, right? You run for election, you get elected, or you propose a referendum. There are ways to achieve the goals in politics. They can't be bothered with politics, so they choose to do things this way. And I want to give an idea of the scale that this has reached because it explains why this is the tack we have to take to deal with it. These kind of places, like the problem with that they have is that they focus on, clicks, they focus on getting citations in newspapers. This encourages outrageous and irresponsible behavior. Sometimes they even finance protests. This also encourages irresponsible behavior. And in typical narcissist fashion, their line is, I'm not using money to do what I want. I'm using money to objectively do good, as defined by me. Right? So it's pretty crazy. A few examples of impact investing would be the European Climate Foundation, the Sortition Complex, the Omidyar Group, Open Society, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and in Germany, because I was giving this talk in Germany, Brand New Bundestag, which helps candidates that agree to its policy. So to give like just an inkling of the scale of this and why I think dealing with it would be effective. The European Climate Foundation gave away spent about 175 million euros in 2023. And they themselves took credit with influencing not now the most recent German election, because there was kind of an unscheduled one, but the one before that. So this is not me saying that they deserve credit for influencing the election. They think they deserve credit for influencing the election. This is pretty negative for us. It's bypassing our democratic institutions. In another example, just to give another example of the scale of this that I'm talking about and why it is not just, a small thing, it really is truly influencing the situation. Democracy Fund is one sub-organization of the Omidyar Group. It had a budget of over $70 million in 2022. And in the middle column here on this chart, you will see the organizations that received money from Democracy Fund that year, whose names begin with A. So unfortunately, I could only fit on the slide the ones that begin with A. There's 25 letters also after this. So then if we take just one of those organizations and drill down on it, so the American Journalism Project, if we drill down on that, you can see that that alone itself is now contributing to funding 45 other so-called independent newspapers. Independent of what? I don't know. Obviously not independent of the American Journalism Project. You'll find that a lot of these places call themselves independent. For some reason, branding themselves as independent is this like enormous part of their branding, even though they're all funded ultimately by people like this or others, right? So they're getting their funding from large donors. They're clearly not independent of them, but they like to call themselves independent. So these places, like these other places, some of them are like they open and close in like a heartbeat. So these are not necessarily all going projects. They just projects that received funding from this other one. And you can see kind of like the scale at which this is operating at. If you remember, this is one sub-organization that gave to one other thing that gave to 45 other things. You will see these things everywhere. You're surrounded by it without really realizing it. Okay, so the scale is like a million times what I'm showing here of impact investing, maybe several million times. And to give you some more input into kind of how this sort of works in a way that does influence politics in at least the wider sense of that word, in ways that are kind of hard to grasp or to be fully transparent. Like if you look at the US, it's very normal for an organization like the Omidyar Group to fund several different kinds of organization. This is not a complete list. This is only a small snippet. But for example, they fund Democracy Fund, which is a 501c3 organization. And 501c3 organizations are charitable organizations that benefit from tax deduction. But because of that, they can't directly participate in political activities, although that's a pretty narrow definition of politics already. But that's okay, because in this situation, they also have a 501c4 organization called Democracy Fund Voice, and they can participate in things like lobbying and advocacy. So you just kind of split the source, the funding at the source, and then you keep going and doing whatever you want to do in ways that were not intended when we created these laws. So these laws are not updated to cope with this situation. And they have another even private foundation called Luminate, and that one just operates according to other rules as well. So you're kind of seeing that they're getting around the fact that different organizations have different rules in order to create kind of these sort of omni organizations, and the media group is just like one of them, like everybody does it, that impact activities in ways that were never intended, like when people made these laws. So we have to update our laws to cope with this situation and to deal with this, because this is how impact investing happens. So you have all these different forms of organizations, and they'll fund things like brand new Bundestag. Just, as I said before, it helps candidates. It helps candidates with like training and support if you agree with their policies. This is pretty weird. It's like creating a kind of shadow party. Parties should be subjected to the party laws, right? Every country has party laws. This is like really getting close to the situation without maybe quite going over it. I'd call it a legal gray area myself, but it's kind of this way of doing things. And like, of course, their strategy is like probably more extreme things and more things that the average voter doesn't really want. If they wanted, they could just vote for it as a party. Like, why would some impact investor be involved? It's ridiculous. In other situations, they will like invest in media. So Illuminate, for example, literally invested in media, in a media outlet called The Correspondent, which again, like, just was like kind of the sort of purveyor of, again, quite like extreme views that clearly people didn't like, and that's why they never bought it and it went under, right? But just kind of, the kind of sorts of things like, shaming people for eating meat, or saying that people should not discuss rights, that rights are beyond debate. So this idea that in a democracy, everything is up for debate, this was something they were very much against, right? Or they'd be publishing articles against. So these things kind of have helped to sort of keep up these delusions and to sort of skew what people may or may not want, right, within the political system. And the influence is ginormous. And you're not seeing in public discourse a grassroots reflection of what people want. You're seeing a reflection of what enormous organizations want. These organizations, and bazillions of others like them, have been pretty prolific contributors to cancel culture, because in this situation, you don't have a two-way street where you have political parties. For example, if a political party said, this is what we're doing, like we're going to meet shame people, fine, yeah, that's fine, go ahead, you have to deal with your voters, you have to deal with your voters on the door, you have to deal with your voters voting you. If that's what you think should be the case, go ahead and deal with the public, right? I mean, anyone who would deal in media where you depend on readers reading your media, or viewers watching your program, also has to deal with that from their viewers, right? If you go around egregiously offending your viewers or your voters, then you will eventually be punished for that. But and I don't mean extrajudicially punished, or like, punished with losing your job or whatever. It'll just be like, people will not support you. I'm not talking about the kind of canceling punishment. I'm just saying people will not support you. They will not give you their vote because you are being egregiously offensive to them. They'll think, I'm just going to vote for somebody else. So, however, in this way, although these are some of the most prolific punishers of other people at random, they've created a system where you can't, as it were, punish them in the ways that society has foreseen, such as, just not giving them your vote or something like that. So because of that, they can kind of maintain their delusions, because they don't depend on anyone for anything. It's just like purely a one-way street. I keep funding people to harangue other people. I keep funding people to push my point of view. I keep funding people to be egregiously offensive to others. And that's just it. I just keep going that way in my rather delusional factory here, because no one's input is ever needed in this other end of the equation. I don't need votes. I don't need likes. I don't need readers. I don't need viewers. So the cycle just kind of perpetuates itself, and they get actually kind of more and more crazy. I think this is why they've gotten more and more and more crazy and extreme, because they don't have that incentive that goes the other way to stop them. I think political parties usually say at a certain point, hey, I'm really ticking a lot of people off. Maybe I should just kind of try to be more in tune with my voters or something like that, right? So this is the issue here, but because they're just dominating the conversation, they're making everybody very angry, and it's very difficult for the rest of us just to have a conversation with each other, which is all we really need to do. And then put that onto a decision, kind of connect that to a decision, obviously. So how do you kind of stop this crazy impact investing, where, as I said, a lot of them are going around rallying people up to insanely punish people in ways that are very sadistic, but at the same time, they can just kind of escape all the consequences of their actions that would otherwise be there. I think part of the answer is to cut off donations coming from foreign sources, because especially for small countries, that can just completely overwhelm your system and displace every grassroots organization in your society. That, however, is difficult legally. In addition to this, I think we should reform laws around charities and NGOs, because these vehicles are been basically abused by impact investors and also to circumvent lobbying laws. So they'll try to kind of make politicians believe their constituents want things that their constituents don't want, right? So that's a big thing they do. Specifically donations to media, which are very common now. You'll see a lot of sponsored content coming from these people. And ownership of media, I think, are things that need to be considered, right? Why would that happen? Maybe media needs to be something that's more connected to the average person, to what their readers are willing to pay for. But most importantly, I think, is that any NGO that attempts to influence policy should not be able to receive money from non-natural people or non-members, or if so, that money should be very, very limited. Right now, you have big donors kind of calling the tune, and they don't care what happens. They don't have really any skin in the game. So I think that should happen, and I think that any member who contributes more than 10% of the budget should have to be a director of the board, because that means that they're legally responsible for what that organization does. So I think that would introduce responsibility and culpability into the situation in a way that is reasonable, that people are responsible for, for example, doing something illegal. I think in that case, what people will say is that then those organizations won't donate money. Well, that's good, because we can't really afford people to be involved in politics without being accountable for their actions in the normally legal ways that we have set up. When you're not tied to that, when you're not tied in any way to politics, and you're not tied in any way to the economy, you're just going to continue to live in a delusion factory and kind of keep going on your own. And unfortunately, that has been very, very harmful for our democracy. So in addition to that, we're just having, a reasonable level of responsibility that everybody else has. All small NGOs have this. All small NGOs have to adhere to these kinds of things, or they de facto do adhere to them. So this is not anything particular. It's just, people going through loopholes. In addition to that, I think somewhat counterintuitively, we have to get back to broad-based decision making. The key is decision making, not engagement. I think what we've done a lot is we have opened up a lot of cans of worms with this, with this impact investing, right? It's opened up questions around all kinds of things, but it has not resolved them, because that's all they do, is they kind of shoot off their mouth and move on to the next thing, shoot off their mouth and move on to the next thing, shoot off their mouth and move on to the next thing. We are not kind of working through those situations, and they kind of keep doing it, and they ignore the feedback of voters when they get a chance to, if they get any chance to at all, which is not good. If I take Ireland, which I think is actually a very positive example in this regard, where there's a lot of problems in Ireland, but I think in this one regard it's very positive. We recently had 2 referendums, and those referendums were almost entirely the work of NGOs who demanded these referendums. In fact, I should say, to put it more succinctly, they demanded the outcomes of the referendums. They did not, and the referendums were a way of getting what they wanted. However, these referendums really, really flopped, because actually it turns out no one wanted what they were peddling. And the thing happened during a referendum in Berlin about accelerating net zero. So the referendum was, we should accelerate net zero. The referendum was lost. Regardless of what you think of those issues, because that's not the point here, decision points are a reality check, right? They are getting back to what went wrong. Okay, if people didn't vote for what you wanted, you have to sort of ask yourself, well, why was that? Was I wrong, or did I not present it right, or is there some other reason? Democratic decisions are therefore kind of like this speed bump on the road of delusion, that you're getting very disconnected from what the average person wants, and you're not fulfilling their needs. So I think that this is something that we've just lost, right? People wonder, well, why was mainstream politics so successful after the Second World War? Well, it's really easy. It wasn't status or education or knowledge. All those things were actually less in the past than they are now. Fewer people went to get on degrees and things like that than they did in the past. But I think the reason is that they had this constant connection between, you know, issue and outcome, and between consent and outcome. We go through a process. At the end of the process, we have this outcome, and then it kind of starts again, and it starts again. It's not just crazy people shooting off their mouths and nothing really happening and things becoming confused. I think that what we've begun to say, what people have begun to say, Dark Tetraders particularly, is, I have an amazing idea, and it's so good, it's irreproachable, and must be instantly implemented, which is narcissism, right? You're too dumb to understand it, so don't even try. It's Machiavellianism. I will punish you if you do. Sadism. And I really don't care about the consequences for you as long as I get my way. Psychopathy. Since the moment that this has been kind of being what's pushed in the mainstream, that, what's important is just to get to the right decision, as often seen by those people who are really in thick with impact investors, things have started to go really wrong. This way of thinking is just mentally unhinging people. And as I hope this talk has demonstrated, a lot of those people were not too hinged in the first place. So this is the last thing you want to do. That coupling needs to go back on between cause and effect, right? And we need to say again, no idea is so good that it can't benefit from scrutiny. Even people less smart than me often make valuable contributions. There's no punishment for trying, and it doesn't really benefit me to implement something that ruins other people I'm dependent on. I mean, as again, not to hype Ireland, but because we just kind of agreed with those referendums and no one ever really called that into question, probably 2/3 of Irish people have forgotten we even had those referendums. Okay, even though this was like a major government screw up and we wasted a lot of money on it. Contrast this to Britain, where people just wouldn't agree. Some people who lost Brexit just felt that they were too good to have to agree to that, and they couldn't accept that they lost, and therefore they unleashed probably an entire decade of political disruption on their country, because they wouldn't just accept, fine, we've become a little bit diluted, we're a bit far from what people want. This is a reality call to us to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and let's try to go from there. And then, the same thing happened after the referendum in Berlin. I got calls from all kinds of NGOs who were just determined that they're going to implement this outcome regardless of whether or not people want it. This creates a lot of strife. It's a Dark Tetrad way of looking at the world. So we need to do both of those things to kind of tether things back to reality, The third thing we need to do is to make meritocracy as opposed to status. The issue with not having a meritocracy is that if you don't have a meritocracy, you automatically have a conferment society. Because if you don't earn things, you have to ask yourself, how are they distributed, right? In a meritocratic society, goods are distributed based on people having earned those goods according to the rules that we have. So, for example, if I think about academia, if someone has met the criteria of the course, they have demonstrated they have ABC skills, then I give them their mark that they passed the course. It doesn't matter if I like them. It doesn't matter if I approve of what they do. They have earned their mark, right? According to the rules. The only other way to do it is to have conferment. I give you something. You didn't earn it. I gave it to you, right? And so that just becomes another playground for Dark Tetraders, because their currency is power over other people. And they like to live in this situation where they give you things without you earning them based on who pleased them the best. And I mean, it's a bad thing in academia sometimes that you see people doing this, right? People kind of trying to think about who has best pleased them with some kind of an X factor, right? If I really like you, I'll be nice to you, and if I don't like you, I won't be nice to you, and if you serve my purposes, I'll give you something, if you don't, I won't. This is a very, very bad way for society to operate, and it gives Dark Tetraders more and more power. The more discretion they have, the more they tend to use that discretion to play God, basically, with other people's lives. And that, again, it's a very, very negative thing for a democracy, right? So people think sometimes, oh, is meritocracy perfect? Well, maybe it's not perfect in a lot of ways, but it's definitely better than a conferment society where goods are handed out based on an X factor. At least in a meritocracy, you know what the rules are, and you can also take measures to cope with any injustices that may arise from those rules, because things are clear. So, in conclusion, the issue of irrationality in decision making is a lot worse than most people think. It's not a matter of tinking around the edges and improving algorithms or anything like that. Those things are actually very likely to be used by dark tetraders because they're really good at enforcing rules on other people mercilessly in ways that were never intended. And unfortunately, over the last decade, we've just given them more and more tools with which to ply their deception and manipulation. The ability to make decisions in closed doors, the, cynical view of media, the impact investing, which is all about affecting society without getting other people's consent. These are all dark tetraeder tools, basically. It's just creating a playground for them to do what they will. And when they give that, then they just act more and more. They get the bit between their teeth as they were, and they act more and more and more and more delusional as time goes on. Right? There is no self-control. So that's never going to happen. You have to change the rules to get it back under control. So there's inherently consequences to everything we do, and expecting a democracy to work without consequences, albeit rule-abiding consequences, well publicized, consensual consequences, that's just ridiculous, right? Because everything we do, unfortunately, has consequences, and we have to live with those. So that's a fundamental irrationality. The Dark Tetrad's desire to escape consequences while imposing those costs on other people. And when we get down in the mud and fight with dark tetraders on their own terms, it creates like an even bigger problem because it's just fighting fire with fire and doing someone does something stupid, so I do something stupid. That's something that's been very, very loved in the past few years. This idea to say, well, it's not hot today, so there can't be global warming. Like that doesn't make any sense. But it also doesn't make sense, or it's not hot today, so there can't be global warming. But it doesn't make any sense to say that it is hot today, so there is global warming. Like arguing about the temperature on any one day is stupid, but that's what people have descended to, like on that particular topic, right? To screaming at each other things that actually don't make any logical sense because people have decided that you have to fight fire with fire. If the other side is dark tetra, then you have to be dark tetra too. Unfortunately, that's not it's a zero-sum game, and it ruins our civilization and ruins democracy. Unfortunately, you're not destroying the other side by doing that, or maybe we shouldn't say unfortunately, but you're not. What you're destroying is the fabric of your civilization, actually, by behaving that way, and that's extremely negative, obviously. The dark tetrad tends to weaken the society that it gets the upper hand in because it's always making, kind of forcing irrational decisions. They're not good to cope with reality. So that's also a very, very negative impact of the dark tetrad, of self-weakening in the society it is in. And that's why we have to come back and get control of it and to make sure that there are clear guidelines that prevent them from getting the upper hand. The good news is that most people are actually light triad, and that means that they score high in values such as altruism, compassion, and empathy. So if you create a better, more even playing field, you will not have this runaway dark tetrad behavior. We just basically have to take their poise away from them, and then to kind of get back to a more grounded version of decision making that kind of enforces that lack of delusional behavior, because that will kind of put other people back in the upper hand on those issues. So that's what this has all been about kind of trying to rein them in, to rein that irrationality in, to say that we need to stop worrying about other people being maybe minorly wrong about something, this or that next thing, and to focus on these major sources of irrationality that are often subtle but have a very large impact on our decision making, and create rules that doesn't just give them, the run of the place, but ensures that everybody's acting in a relatively accountable way as part of this decision making process. So kind of a lot of subtlety, I suppose, in some ways in dealing with them, but also a source of a lot of disturbances that can be relatively easily stopped without having to control, the entire internet or to take draconian solutions. Everything I've presented are actually very compatible with democracy. They don't require control, doesn't require censorship. It doesn't even require stopping any people who are dark, score highly in dark tetrad traits from participating. They can continue to participate. They just have to participate in ways that are less extremely destructive to the entire process. That's all that it's doing. So I think it's important to always consider that with democracy, to do things that are not that don't involve censorship or depriving people of those freedom. Even if those people do score highly in dark tetrad traits, that's fine. But it just creates a situation where it makes it harder for them to get their way. Okay, so that's everything. I do highly recommend. There's a lot of, you can read on the internet a lot of things about the Dark Tetrad in relationship to like relationships and things like that. I think it is very interesting to look more into the Dark Tetrad. I mentioned the people who developed the framework. If you were to Google them and to look at their work or to look at the experiments that other people do, I think it's a really, really actually fascinating kind of topic, and I think it's very fascinating to learn more about the way people can operate in that way. And I think if you want to do it in your own life too, just helping to identify when people are acting that way is actually very, very useful way to cope with irrationality, politically and also personally as well. So I definitely would recommend looking into that to anyone who's interested in this in more detail. Thanks.